The coastal town of Salt Haven lay cradled between jagged cliffs and a restless sea, its salty air carrying whispers of secrets long buried. Mara Davenport arrived just as the first blush of dawn spilled over the horizon, casting the water in hues of copper and gold. Her old sedan groaned to a stop on the gravel road overlooking the harbor, where fishing boats bobbed like forgotten toys. Salt Haven seemed timeless, untouched by the world's hurried evolution. And yet, as Mara stepped out of her car, a strange sensation pricked at her skin, a subtle hum beneath the surface of reality, as if the town itself was alive. Mara had come seeking a fresh start. The lighthouse, offered to her at a suspiciously low price, was meant to be her redemption project. After years of failed ventures and an aching loneliness she couldn't shake, she had convinced herself this was fate's way of giving her a second chance. But as she stood there, the lighthouse in the distance loomed like a skeletal sentinel, its silhouette stark against the fiery sky. The first few hours in Salt Haven were a blur of introductions. The townsfolk were polite, though guarded. At the diner, a grizzled fisherman named Gil offered her a warning she dismissed as small-town superstition. "The lighthouse ain't just bricks and mortar," he said, his voice gravelly like crushed seashells. "It remembers things better left forgotten." Mara chuckled nervously, waving it off, but the unease in his eyes lingered in her mind long after she left. By midday, Mara reached the lighthouse, standing solitary at the edge of the cliffs. The structure had seen better days. Its white paint was now a patchwork of peeling flakes, and the once proud lantern room was little more than a rusted skeleton. Still, Mara saw its potential. With the right care, this could be a beacon of hope, an ironic thought, given its intended purpose. She ran her fingers along the weathered stone, feeling an odd warmth emanate from it despite the cool breeze. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of salt and decay. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight filtering through cracked windows. The keeper's quarters were cluttered with remnants of the past, a tarnished compass, faded nautical charts, and an oil lantern that seemed almost pristine. On the desk lay an old journal, its leather cover warped with age. Curious, Mara flipped through it, finding sketches of strange sea creatures and cryptic notes written in a hurried scrawl. One entry caught her eye. "The waves speak, but we must not listen." That night, Mara's sleep was restless. The sound of waves crashing against the cliffs seemed unnaturally loud, as though amplified by the wind. She dreamt of the ocean, vast and consuming, its surface rippling with shadows that swam just below. In the dream, the lighthouse was whole, its light piercing through the dark, but instead of illuminating the sea, it revealed something monstrous, a shape so immense it defied comprehension. Mara woke with a start. The image burned into her mind. The following morning, she explored the grounds surrounding the lighthouse. The cliffs were treacherous, jagged rocks jutting out like the broken teeth of some great beast. She noticed something peculiar, carvings etched into the stone near the base of the lighthouse. They were faint, almost eroded by time, but distinct enough to unsettle her. The symbols were unfamiliar, spirals, waves, and shapes that resembled eyes. When she asked Gil about them later, his expression darkened. "Don't go messing with what you don't understand," he said. "This town's history runs deep, and not all of it's pretty." He refused to elaborate, muttering something about the old ways before hastily excusing himself. Determined not to let superstition deter her, Mara threw herself into the restoration. Yet, as the days passed, her initial optimism began to wane. Tools went missing, only to reappear in odd places. Objects shifted inexplicably when her back was turned. And then there were the whispers, soft, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. At first, she thought it was the wind, but no matter how she tried to rationalize it, the sound always returned. One evening, as Mara stood at the edge of the cliffs, she felt the full weight of Salt Haven's eerie charm. The sun sank into the horizon, casting long shadows over the town. The waves whispered below, their voices a haunting melody that seemed to call her name. For the first time, Mara felt the pull of the ocean, not as a place of peace, but as something ancient and insistent, demanding her attention. And so, as darkness enveloped Salthaven, Mara resolved to uncover the truth about the lighthouse and the town that seemed both welcoming and menacing. What secrets had drawn her here, and what price would she pay to reveal them? Little did she know, the waves would soon whisper louder, and the answer she sought would come with a cost far greater than she imagined. The following morning brought with it a heavy fog that blanketed Salthaven, muffling the world as though the town itself had been swallowed whole. Mara woke to the lighthouse groaning against the wind, its creaks and moans eerily human. As she made her way down the spiraling staircase to the ground floor, she felt an unfamiliar heaviness in the air, a weight that pressed against her chest. Outside, the ocean was hidden from view, its rhythmic crashing the only reminder of its presence. Mara decided to spend the day clearing the overgrown pathways that wound around the lighthouse. Armed with a rusted rake and a pair of gloves she found in the old keeper's quarters, she set to work uncovering the stone walkways that had been reclaimed by wild grass and moss. Hours passed as she chipped away at nature's encroachment, revealing a network of trails she hadn't noticed before. They seemed to snake down toward the beach, where the tide had receded, exposing a vast stretch of sand. Drawn by curiosity, Mara followed one of the trails to the beach. The air was damp and carried the faint metallic scent of seaweed. The sand was cold beneath her boots, and scattered across it were fragments of shells, driftwood, and odd shapes glinting in the muted light. As she moved closer, she realized the glints weren't stones or glass, but objects partially buried in the sand. She crouched down, brushing away the grains to reveal what appeared to be a small, tarnished trinket, a pendant in the shape of a spiral, its metal warped with age. The pendant was heavier than it looked, and its intricate design struck her as familiar, though she couldn't place where she'd seen it before. As she turned it over in her hands, a sudden chill ran down her spine, and she glanced around, feeling as though she were being watched. The fog hung thick, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant caw of a gull. Mara pocketed the pendant and continued her search, finding more objects scattered along the beach: a child's shoe, a cracked compass, and a fragment of what looked like a porcelain doll's face. It was the doll's face that unsettled her the most. The features were faint, worn smooth by time and the ocean's relentless touch, but the empty eye sockets seemed to stare back at her. Mara's unease deepened when she noticed that the objects were arranged in a vague pattern, as though someone, or something, had placed them deliberately. That night, Mara couldn't shake the feeling that the pendant carried some significance. She set it on the desk beside the old keeper's journal and studied them side by side. The journal's cryptic sketches suddenly felt more ominous. Many bore striking similarities to the pendant's spiral design. One page in particular caught her attention: a crude map of Salthaven's coastline, marked with symbols she couldn't decipher. At the center of the map was the lighthouse, surrounded by concentric circles that seemed to radiate outward. As she stared at the map, she noticed faint writing in the margins, almost invisible against the yellowed paper. Lighting a nearby lantern, she squinted at the text, which read, "The currents remember, and so must we." A strange unease gripped her, and she glanced toward the window. Outside, the fog had thickened, and though the ocean was obscured, she could hear the waves louder than ever, their rhythm punctuated by an occasional low groan, like the breath of a slumbering beast. The next day, Mara returned to the beach with a notebook and a determination to document what she had found. She spent hours cataloging the scattered objects, marking their locations on a sketch of the area. The pendant, now hanging around her neck, seemed to pulse faintly against her skin, though she told herself it was just her imagination. As she worked, she noticed something peculiar. The pattern of the objects mirrored the spiral design on the pendant. Her discovery was interrupted by the arrival of a man she hadn't seen before. He was tall and wiry, with sunken eyes and a pallor that made him seem almost spectral. He introduced himself as Elias, a local historian, and claimed he had heard about her restoration efforts. Elias's smile didn't reach his eyes, and his gaze lingered too long on the pendant around her neck. "That's an interesting piece you've got there," he remarked casually. "Found it on the beach, did you?" When Mara nodded, his expression darkened, and he added in a low voice, "You do well to leave things where they belong. The past has a way of demanding what's owed." Elias left as abruptly as he'd arrived, his warning hanging in the air like a storm cloud. As Mara watched him disappear into the fog, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled into something far larger than herself. The pendant felt heavier than ever, and the whispers of the waves seemed to grow louder, carrying with them an ominous promise. The past was not forgotten, and it was coming for her. Mara awoke to a pounding sound that seemed to reverberate through the lighthouse walls. At first, she thought it was her heart racing in response to the vivid dreams that had plagued her sleep. Images of swirling water and shadowy figures had woven through her subconscious, their meanings elusive, but their presence undeniable. But as the pounding grew louder, she realized it was coming from the front door. Wrapping herself in a coat against the morning chill, she descended the spiral staircase, her footsteps echoing in the hollow space. When she opened the door, she found nothing but the morning mist and the faint outline of the beach below. The rhythmic crash of the waves served as the only explanation for the sound, though it didn't sit right with her. Still, she closed the door and returned inside, dismissing it as a trick of the wind. The day's light was thin and pale, and Mara decided to resume her cataloging on the beach. She was determined to make sense of the objects she had uncovered and the strange patterns they formed. Clutching her notebook, she ventured down the path she had cleared the day before, her boots crunching against the stones. As she neared the shoreline, she noticed something odd. The arrangement of the objects had changed. Where the fragments had previously been scattered in a rough spiral, they now seemed to form deliberate lines converging toward a central point. At that point lay something new, a large, weathered chest half buried in the sand. Its wood was blackened, as though charred by fire, and its iron hinges were corroded with rust. Mara approached cautiously, her breath shallow as she knelt to examine the chest. It took considerable effort to pry it open, and when she did, the lid creaked on its hinges like a dying gasp. Inside, she found a collection of items that sent a shiver through her. More fragments of porcelain dolls, a bundle of letters sealed with brittle wax, and a bundle of tattered rope that smelled faintly of salt and decay. At the bottom of the chest lay a photograph encased in cracked glass. It depicted a group of people standing in front of the lighthouse, their faces blurred as if by motion or time. The photograph captivated her. She recognized the lighthouse in the background, though it looked newer and better maintained. But what truly caught her attention was the faint figure standing apart from the group. It wasn't entirely visible, shrouded in shadow and mist even in the image, but something about it felt familiar. Mara tucked the photograph in her notebook and carried the letters back to the lighthouse for closer inspection. Once inside, she laid the letters out on the desk, careful not to damage their fragile paper. The wax seals crumbled under her touch, and she unfolded the first letter with trembling hands. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, as though written in desperation. It read, "The tide carries secrets, and the lighthouse guards them. Do not disturb the currents, for they guard more than water. They guard us." The cryptic warning sent a chill through her. She read through the other letters, finding similar messages written by different hands. Each spoke of the currents as though they were alive, with one letter warning of a hunger beneath the waves. One letter was signed by a name that struck her, Elias Mercer. The same Elias who had visited her yesterday? It seemed impossible. The ink looked decades old, and the letterhead bore the name of a local historical society that had disbanded years ago. That evening, Mara's unease grew. The fog thickened outside, and the lighthouse's beam seemed to falter, as though struggling against an unseen force. She heard sounds she couldn't explain, low murmurs that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The pendant around her neck felt cold against her skin, and the longer she wore it, the more it seemed to weigh her down. As midnight approached, Mara heard a knock at the door. It was soft at first, then insistent, each strike reverberating through the lighthouse. Gripping a flashlight, she opened the door cautiously, expecting to find Elias or perhaps one of the locals she hadn't met yet. Instead, she was greeted by the sight of nothing but fog, thick and impenetrable. But as she stood there, the flashlight beam caught something in the mist, a fleeting shadow that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. The ocean's roar grew louder, almost deafening, and she slammed the door shut, her heart racing. She leaned against the door, listening to the silence that followed, broken only by the rhythmic pulse of the waves. The lighthouse groaned again, and Mara realized she was no longer certain whether the sound was the building or something else entirely. The letter's warnings echoed in her mind, their cryptic pleas taking on a sinister weight. She knew now that whatever she had stumbled upon, it was not meant to be unearthed. Yet, she also knew that leaving Salthaven was no longer an option. Mara awoke to a restless unease, the kind that settled deep into her bones. The events of the previous night loomed large in her mind. The mysterious letters, the ominous knock, and the fleeting shadow in the fog. As the first rays of sunlight fought through the dense mist outside, she resolved to take matters into her own hands. Answers were buried somewhere in Salthaven, and she intended to unearth them. Her first stop was the small library in the town square. Salthaven's library was an unassuming brick building, its walls weathered by the relentless sea air. Inside, the scent of aged paper mingled with the faint brine of the ocean. The librarian, a wiry woman with piercing blue eyes named Agnes, greeted Mara with a curious tilt of her head. "Looking for something specific?" Agnes asked, her voice low but steady. "Yes," Mara replied hesitantly. "I'm looking for anything on the history of the lighthouse and the tides. Maybe something about Elias Mercer." At the mention of Elias's name, Agnes froze, her expression shifting from polite interest to something more guarded. "Mercer's name hasn't come up in years," she murmured almost to herself. After a long pause, she nodded and led Mara to a secluded corner of the library, where a cluster of dusty volumes and folders awaited. The records were sparse but unsettling. The lighthouse, it turned out, had a history of strange events. Over the decades, multiple keepers had vanished without a trace, their belongings left untouched. One article detailed the sudden disappearance of a fishing crew in 1912. Their ship found adrift near the lighthouse, its deck littered with fragments of porcelain. The name Elias Mercer appeared repeatedly in the records, often as the author of cryptic letters to local authorities. Mara's pulse quickened as she flipped through the pages. One passage caught her attention, a transcript of a warning from Elias himself, dated 1947. "The currents are restless. They speak in whispers, and their hunger grows. The lighthouse must stand as our beacon and our prison." The words mirrored the letter she had found in the chest, their tone urgent and foreboding. Agnes watched Mara intently as she absorbed the information. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Agnes asked suddenly. "Seen what?" Mara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "The shadow," Agnes said. "It comes for those who disturb what lies beneath the waves. Salthaven's been quiet for years because we've left it alone. But now," she trailed off, her gaze falling to the floor. Mara's thoughts raced as she left the library, clutching a notebook filled with hastily scrawled notes. She returned to the lighthouse, where the sound of the ocean seemed louder than ever, a relentless rhythm that echoed in her mind. The photograph from the chest still lay on her desk, and she studied it closely once more. This time, she noticed something she hadn't before. The shadowy figure in the photograph wasn't merely standing apart from the group. It seemed to be leaning toward the lighthouse, its blurred form unnaturally elongated. The more Mara stared at it, the more it seemed to shift, as if it were moving within the frame. As the day gave way to evening, Mara found herself drawn back to the beach. The tide was unusually high, lapping hungrily at the shore. The chest was gone, swept away or perhaps reclaimed by the ocean. Yet, the strange arrangement of objects remained, more intricate than before. They now formed a spiral, so precise it seemed unnatural, the pattern leading toward the waves. The pendant around Mara's neck grew colder, and a low hum seemed to emanate from the water. She crouched near the edge of the spiral, her fingers brushing against a fragment of porcelain. The moment she touched it, a vision overtook her, a fleeting, fragmented image of the shadow, larger now, its form writhing and shifting like water in a storm. She stumbled back, gasping for air. The ocean roared in response, a sound that was no longer natural but alive, pulsating with intent. Mara scrambled up the beach, her mind spinning with questions and fears. That night, as she locked the lighthouse door, the hum in the air persisted, growing louder as the hours passed. The beam of the lighthouse flickered weakly, and Mara swore she could hear whispers in the wind. Each breath she took felt heavy, as though the weight of the tides themselves bore down on her. The secrets of Salt Haven were no longer buried. They were awake, and they were watching. The storm struck Salt Haven with an abrupt fury, as though summoned by an unseen hand. Mara was jolted awake by the violent howling of the wind, the lighthouse groaning under its assault. Rain lashed the windows like shards of glass, and the beam of the light above faltered, dimming into a nervous, inconsistent glow. Instinct urged Mara to climb the spiral stairs to the lantern room, but her heart was heavy with a sense of impending dread. The metallic stairs clanged under her hurried steps as she ascended. When she reached the top, she found the machinery erratic, its rotations jerking like a wounded beast. The bulb flickered dangerously, casting jagged shadows across the room. Through the misted glass, Mara saw the ocean churning in chaos. The waves surged higher than she had ever seen, clawing at the rocky cliff on which the lighthouse stood. But it wasn't the storm that stole her breath. It was the figure standing at the edge of the cliff, unmoving despite the gale-force winds. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed elongated, bending slightly against the wind like reeds in water. Its head turned sharply toward the lighthouse, though no features could be discerned. Mara froze, her hand gripping the railing as the figure raised one arm, pointing directly at her. A deafening crack shattered the moment. The glass of the lantern room splintered as something massive struck it from outside, a wave or something carried within it. The lighthouse shuddered, and Mara staggered backward, shielding her face from the flying shards. When the chaos subsided, the figure was gone, but a new horror awaited her gaze. The ocean had receded unnaturally, exposing the seabed in a grotesque, yawning stretch of wet sand and scattered debris. At the center of this exposed expanse was something ancient and immense, a structure, perhaps, or the remains of one. Its form was jagged and alien, protruding from the earth like the ribcage of a buried beast. A low, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through Mara's very bones. It was the same sound she had heard by the beach, but amplified now, as though the storm itself had become a voice. Desperate to make sense of what she was seeing, she stumbled back down the stairs to her desk, grabbing her notebook and the old photograph. She noticed something different in the photograph now. The shadowy figure that had leaned toward the lighthouse was clearer, its edges sharper, and its stance more menacing. The group of people in the image seemed smaller, almost huddled, as though retreating from the growing presence of the shadow. Mara flipped through her notebook, her notes spiraling into chaos with every page. The pieces didn't fit. The letters from Elias Mercer spoke of tides that whispered, of a hunger beneath the waves, and of the lighthouse standing as a sentinel. But against what? Was it a warning or a trap? A knock on the door shattered her thoughts. It was urgent, almost panicked. Mara hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. Who could possibly be out in such a storm? She opened the door cautiously, revealing Agnes, the librarian, drenched and shivering. "You need to come with me," Agnes said, her voice trembling. "There's no time to explain." Mara started to protest, but the look in Agnes's eyes silenced her. It wasn't fear, it was resolve. Without another word, Mara grabbed her coat and followed Agnes into the storm, the wind biting at their faces as they made their way to the library. Once inside, Agnes locked the door and pulled a bundle of papers from her satchel. "The lighthouse isn't just a beacon," she said, spreading the papers across the table. "It's a seal, and it's breaking." The room seemed to shrink around Mara as she stared at the faded blueprints and journal entries Agnes had unearthed. They detailed modifications to the lighthouse over decades, symbols etched into its foundation, and rituals performed under the guise of maintenance. The purpose was clear. The lighthouse wasn't built to guide, it was built to contain. The final journal entry was from Elias Mercer himself, scrawled in a shaky hand. "They will come when the tide recedes. If the seal fails, the town will fall." Mara's mind reeled as she connected the pieces. The storm, the retreating ocean, the figure on the cliff, it was all part of something ancient and unrelenting. She looked at Agnes, her voice barely a whisper. "What do we do?" Agnes's face was pale but resolute. "We hold the line," she said, "or we're all lost." The storm raged through the night, unrelenting in its ferocity. Mara and Agnes pored over the weathered blueprints and cryptic journal entries in the dim light of the library. The air was thick with tension, every creak of the wooden beams above sounding like the prelude to disaster. Agnes explained the symbols etched into the lighthouse's foundation, a series of runes that defied any language Mara had ever studied. "These are ancient," Agnes said, her finger tracing the faint lines on the page. "They predate this town. Perhaps they even predate language as we know it." Her voice wavered, a tremor betraying the fear she tried to suppress. Mara leaned closer, studying the intricate patterns. "And they're failing?" she asked, her words heavy with disbelief. Agnes nodded. "The storm isn't just weather. It's a catalyst. Whatever was sealed beneath that lighthouse is stirring, and it's using the storm to weaken the barrier." A sharp knock at the library door made them both jump. Mara grabbed the closest heavy object, a brass candlestick, as Agnes cautiously approached the entrance. When the door creaked open, they were greeted by a disheveled figure. Lawrence, the town's only fisherman brave enough to venture out in storms. He was soaked to the bone, his face pale and etched with terror. "You've got to come to the docks," he blurted out, his voice hoarse. "There's something wrong with the water." The three of them braved the storm, Lawrence leading the way. The rain lashed at their faces as they hurried through the winding streets of Salt Haven. By the time they reached the docks, the sight that greeted them left Mara speechless. The ocean had risen again, but the waves moved unnaturally, as though something massive churned beneath the surface. Glowing tendrils of light snaked through the water, illuminating grotesque shapes that defied reason. Shadows danced and twisted, their forms suggesting creatures Mara couldn't fully comprehend. Lawrence gestured frantically toward the end of the pier. "I saw them, faces in the waves. They were watching me." Mara squinted, the rain blurring her vision. For a moment, she thought she saw what Lawrence was talking about. Faint, distorted visages rising and falling with the waves, their mouths moving as if whispering secrets the living were never meant to hear. "Agnes, are you seeing this?" Mara whispered, her voice trembling. Agnes nodded grimly. "The seal's breaking faster than I thought. Whatever's down there, it's waiting. It's calling." A sudden, piercing sound cut through the storm, making them all flinch. It was the lighthouse's foghorn, but it was deeper, more resonant, and carried an almost mournful tone. Mara's heart sank. "The light's failing again," she muttered. Before they could react, the ground beneath them trembled. The pier groaned as if in pain, the wood splintering under their feet. Mara grabbed Agnes and Lawrence, pulling them back towards solid ground just as a massive wave crashed onto the pier, dragging parts of it into the sea. As they scrambled for safety, Mara's mind raced. The seal wasn't just breaking, it was being actively dismantled. But by whom? Or by what? The figure she had seen on the cliff returned to her mind, its unnatural presence seared into her thoughts. Back at the library, soaked and shaken, Mara turned to Agnes. "There's more to this than the storm or the lighthouse," she said. "Something is helping this happen. Someone—" Agnes hesitated, then pulled out another sheet of paper from her satchel. It was a letter dated decades earlier, addressed to Elias Mercer. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was chilling. The sea does not forget, nor do they forgive. The beacon cannot hold forever. Mara stared at the letter, her chest tightening. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, almost as if it were laughing. Somewhere beneath the waves, something ancient and merciless was rising, and it wasn't coming alone. Salt Haven was silent by dawn, though not in the peaceful sense. It was a hollow, uneasy stillness, as if the town itself held its breath. The storm had moved inland, leaving a bruised sky in its wake, but the sea remained restless. The waves rolled in, unnaturally smooth, their surfaces shimmering with an oily sheen that made them seem alive. Mara stood on the library steps, staring out at the horizon. Agnes sat beside her, flipping through pages of old journal entries with a desperation born of dwindling hope. Lawrence had taken to patrolling the shoreline with a harpoon, muttering under his breath about the faces he had seen in the waves. "I can't shake the feeling that it's all connected," Mara said, breaking the silence. "The letters, the seal, that thing on the cliff. It's like a puzzle, but the pieces keep shifting." Agnes closed the book with a sigh, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "There's a reason Mercer left these records behind," she said. "He wanted someone to know, to prepare." She handed Mara an envelope, its edges frayed with age. "This might be the last clue he left us." Mara opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink faded but still legible. It wasn't a letter this time. It was a map. The outline of Salt Haven was familiar, but it was overlaid with strange markings, spirals, intersecting lines, and symbols that mirrored the runes in the lighthouse. At the center of it all was a location marked with a small, deliberate X. "This isn't the lighthouse," Mara said, tracing her finger over the map. "This is the old salt mine." Agnes nodded grimly. The mine was abandoned decades ago after a collapse. But if Mercer marked it, there must be something there. Their journey to the mine was tense and uneventful. The path wound through dense forest, the trees gnarled and bent as if weighed down by unseen burdens. Lawrence insisted on coming along, his harpoon slung over his shoulder, though his constant glances over his shoulder betrayed his unease. The entrance to the mine was sealed with rusted metal bars, a warning sign hanging crookedly from one of the posts. "Danger, unstable structure," it read in peeling red letters. Mara felt a pang of doubt, but pushed it aside. The answers they needed were inside. Breaking the lock was surprisingly easy, the old metal crumbling under Lawrence's crowbar. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying a faint, briny scent that didn't belong underground. They lit their flashlights and stepped inside, the beams cutting through the darkness to reveal narrow tunnels lined with jagged rock. It didn't take long to find the symbols. They were carved into the walls at irregular intervals, their grooves filled with something that shimmered faintly in the light. The designs matched those on the map, spiraling inward toward a deeper part of the mine. As they ventured further, the humming began again, faint at first but growing louder with every step. It wasn't just sound, it was pressure, a weight that seemed to settle in their chests and vibrate in their bones. They reached a chamber at the end of the main tunnel, its walls covered in carvings. At the center was a stone pedestal, upon which rested a small, rusted object. It was shaped like a key, but its design was unlike anything Mara had ever seen, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. "This is it," Agnes whispered, her voice reverent. "This must be the key to the seal." Before Mara could respond, the humming intensified, transforming into a deafening roar. The ground beneath them trembled, and the carvings on the walls began to glow. A voice echoed through the chamber, deep and guttural, speaking words that no human tongue could form. Lawrence dropped his harpoon, clutching his ears. "We need to get out of here," he shouted. But Mara couldn't move. Her eyes were locked on the pedestal, where the key seemed to pulse with light, resonating with the voice. She reached out, her hand trembling as it neared the artifact. "Mara, don't!" Agnes screamed, grabbing her arm and pulling her back just as the chamber floor cracked open, revealing an abyss that glowed with a sickly green light. The roar subsided, leaving an eerie silence. The key remained on the pedestal, but the glow had faded. Mara stared at it, her heart pounding. "Whatever that was," she said, her voice shaking. "It's awake now." They fled the mine, the hum of the seal's failure chasing them back to the surface. The air outside felt no safer, the sea on the horizon swirling in unnatural patterns. Mara clutched the map tightly, her mind racing. "We've started something," Agnes said, her face pale. "And we can't stop it." As the three of them stood in the forest's edge, the ground beneath them seemed to pulse faintly, as if echoing the heartbeat of something vast and unfathomable. The return to Salthaven was marked by an oppressive silence that seemed to blanket the entire town. The hum they had heard in the mine now echoed faintly in the back of Mara's mind, as if it had embedded itself into her very thoughts. Lawrence lagged behind, his harpoon dragging on the dirt path. Agnes clutched a flashlight as if it were a weapon, her knuckles white. By the time they reached the main square, Salthaven looked different. The storm's aftermath should have been mundane. Fallen branches, waterlogged streets. But instead, the town felt distorted. The shadows seemed darker, the angles of the buildings slightly skewed, as though they had been rearranged while no one was looking. Mara's first instinct was to check the library. She needed answers, and the dusty archives had always provided some thread to follow. But as they approached, they saw that the doors were wide open, swaying gently in the wind. Inside, the familiar smell of old paper was tainted with something metallic and acrid. "What happened here?" Mara whispered, stepping over shattered glass. The library had been ransacked. Books lay in piles on the floor, their pages torn. Shelves were tipped over, and the table where Agnes had been working was overturned. "Someone or something was looking for something," Agnes said, scanning the destruction. Her gaze landed on the map, now tucked into Mara's jacket pocket. "They know what we have." Lawrence was already moving, his footsteps loud against the creaking floorboards. "We're wasting time," he said. "That thing in the mine, it knows we took the key. We need to leave town before it comes for us." But Mara shook her head. "Leave and go where? If the seal is broken, this isn't just about Salthaven. Whatever's out there, it'll spread." Before Lawrence could argue, a sharp, echoing noise cut through the air. It was the sound of something heavy scraping against stone, coming from the direction of the shoreline. All three of them froze, their breaths caught in their throats. "We need to see what that is," Mara said, already heading toward the sound. The beach was deserted, the tide higher than it should have been. The ocean's surface churned unnaturally, forming spirals that seemed almost intentional. As they approached, Mara noticed something glinting in the sand. It was a piece of metal, twisted and blackened, half buried in the shore. Nearby, other fragments littered the beach, their edges sharp and jagged. Agnes bent down to examine one, her expression darkening. "These aren't just debris. They're parts of the lighthouse." The implications hung heavy in the air. The lighthouse was the seal's final defense, and now it was crumbling. Mara's mind raced as she pieced together what they had learned so far. Mercer had designed the lighthouse as a barrier, its light imbued with whatever ancient power held the entity at bay. But with the key removed, the structure was failing. The sound of scraping grew louder, pulling their attention to the water. Something was emerging from the sea, a figure, humanoid but wrong. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, as though it were unused to walking. Its skin gleamed with an iridescent sheen, and its eyes glowed faintly in the twilight. Lawrence raised his harpoon, his hands shaking. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, stepping back. The figure stopped at the water's edge, its head tilting as it regarded them. Then it spoke, its voice a blend of human tones and something far more guttural. "The seal has been breached. You carry its mark." Mara's blood ran cold. "The mark?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure gestured to her chest, and Mara realized with horror that the faint hum she had felt since the mine was growing louder. It wasn't just in her head, it was coming from her. "You are the key now," the figure said, its voice resonating in the depths of her mind. "And the gate is opening." Before Mara could respond, the figure turned and dissolved back into the ocean, its form melting into the spiraling waves. She stared at the spot where it had stood, her heart pounding. "We need to figure this out," Agnes said, her voice sharp with urgency. "If you're connected to the seal now, there has to be a way to use that connection. But we don't have much time." Lawrence let out a hollow laugh. "Time for what? It's already too late. That thing, whatever it is, knows where we are. It's just playing with us now." Mara clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. "Then we don't wait for it to come to us. We go back to the mine and end this." The hum in her chest grew louder as she spoke, as though it were answering her determination. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. Whatever they faced, Mara would have to confront it head-on. And this time, the stakes were higher than ever. The journey back to the mine was cloaked in an eerie stillness, the kind that seemed to press against the skin and seep into the bones. Mara, Agnes, and Lawrence moved as one, their footsteps echoing against the cracked cobblestones of Salthaven streets. The air smelled of brine and decay, an unsettling combination that made every breath feel heavier than the last. The hum within Mara's chest was growing stronger with each step, a strange cadence that matched the rhythm of her heartbeat. "Are you sure about this?" Lawrence asked, his voice low but tense. He carried his harpoon tightly, his knuckles white against the shaft. "That thing said you're the key. What if walking into that mine makes it worse?" Mara hesitated but kept her eyes forward. "If I'm the key, then maybe I can lock the gate again. We don't have any other choice." She glanced at Agnes, seeking reassurance. Agnes nodded but looked grim. "The seal's connection to you could work both ways. We need to tread carefully. Whatever power is in that mine, it knows you now." As they neared the mine's entrance, they noticed something was different. The wooden beams that once framed the tunnel were warped and splintered, as if the structure itself was recoiling from whatever was inside. The faint hum that had followed them from the beach was now an audible vibration, resonating through the earth beneath their feet. The trio entered cautiously, their flashlights casting jittery beams against the cavern walls. The air inside the mine was thick and oppressive, carrying a metallic tang that clung to their tongues. Shadows danced unnaturally in the corners of their vision, moving even when their lights stood still. Mara's chest ached with the intensity of the hum now. It was no longer just a vibration. It was a presence, an invasive force that seemed to pull her deeper into the mine. She gritted her teeth and pressed on, her fingers brushing against the cold, damp stone for balance. It wasn't long before they reached the chamber where they had found the key, but the space had changed. The symbols on the walls, once faded and indistinct, now glowed with a pulsating light, casting the room in an unnatural red hue. The pedestal where the key had rested was cracked, oozing a dark liquid that glistened like oil but smelled of sulfur. "What is this place?" Agnes whispered, her voice trembling. Mara didn't answer. Her attention was fixed on the far wall, where an archway had appeared, a doorway that hadn't been there before. The arch was lined with the same glowing symbols, and beyond it was a swirling void, a chasm of darkness that seemed to ripple with life. "It's the gate," Mara said, her voice barely audible over the hum. As if responding to her words, the symbols around the arch flared brighter, and a figure stepped through the void. It was humanoid but grotesquely distorted, its limbs too long and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes were hollow pits, yet Mara felt them boring into her, stripping her of every defense. "Do you hear it?" The figure rasped, its voice a chorus of overlapping tones. "The call of the abyss? It welcomes you, bearer of the mark." Lawrence raised his harpoon instinctively, but Mara held out a hand to stop him. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. The figure tilted its head further, as if amused. "To fulfill the pact. You hold the key now. You will open the gate fully, and the old ones will return. Salthaven will be their foothold, and the world will drown in their shadow." "No," Mara said, her voice firm. "I won't let that happen." The figure stretched one unnaturally long arm toward her, its fingers twisting in the air. Mara felt the hum in her chest intensify, a searing pain radiating outward. She fell to her knees, clutching her chest as the symbols on the walls flared brighter. Agnes rushed to her side, shaking her. "Mara, focus. Whatever connection you have to the gate, you can fight it through the pain." Mara's thoughts coalesced. The hum wasn't just a force acting on her. It was part of her now. She could feel its rhythm, its pulse, and she realized she could push back. With all her strength, she concentrated on that rhythm, forcing it to slow, to weaken. The glow in the room dimmed, and the figure recoiled, its hollow eyes narrowing. "You meddle with forces you cannot comprehend," it hissed. "Maybe," Mara said, her voice strained, "but I'm not giving in to you." The figure retreated into the void, and the archway began to collapse, the symbols flickering out one by one. The hum in Mara's chest faded to a faint whisper, leaving her trembling but alive. "We need to get out of here," Lawrence said, pulling her to her feet. As they stumbled back toward the surface, Mara couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The gate had been weakened, but it wasn't closed, and whatever waited beyond it wasn't going to give up so easily. The walk back to the town felt like moving through a dream, the oppressive weight of the mind still hanging in the air, pressing down on Mara's shoulders. The hum, though weaker, hadn't completely disappeared. It lingered, like a distant echo, vibrating just beneath the surface of her skin. She tried to focus on the world around her. The way the moonlight bathed the coastal cliffs in a silvery glow, the smell of salt in the air. But every step felt like a reminder that things had changed. They weren't in Salt Haven anymore. They were somewhere far darker. Lawrence, though physically present, was quiet, lost in thought. He had not said a word since they had left the mine. Mara could see the tension in his posture, his steps stiff, as though he was battling with the weight of what they had just witnessed. Agnes, on the other hand, had taken the lead, her eyes constantly scanning the darkened surroundings, her fingers curled around the flashlight like a weapon. The quiet was suffocating, and the only sounds were the rustling of the trees and the distant crashing of the waves against the shore. "What do we do now?" Mara asked, her voice breaking the silence. She could feel the eyes of both Agnes and Lawrence on her, and for the first time, the fear was no longer masked by determination. It was real, palpable. The figure they had encountered in the mine wasn't just a hallucination. It was something much worse, something ancient that wanted to drag them all into its dark embrace. Agnes stopped, turning slowly to face Mara. "The mine is only part of it," she said quietly. "The gate was never just a physical barrier. It was connected to Salt Haven itself. The town, its history. Everything here has been a part of this ritual. We need to find the heart of the town, where the connection is strongest." Lawrence snorted bitterly. "So, what? We go back to the town square and hope the answers are written in stone? We barely made it out of the mine alive. I'm not sure there's much more left of this town worth saving." Mara met his gaze, her face hardening. "You're wrong. It's not about saving the town. It's about stopping whatever that thing was. The seal might have cracked, but it's not all gone yet. I think there's still a chance." Agnes nodded in agreement. "The key in the mine, the markings we found, the symbols on the lighthouse. They were all part of a much bigger system. If we can find the source of the power that sustains the gate, we can stop it from opening fully." The silence between them stretched out, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of earlier. Now it was the quiet before a storm, before the final clash. The tension hung in the air, thick and heavy. As they continued walking toward the town, Mara's mind raced. She couldn't shake the vision of that thing in the mine. The way it had stood there, impossibly tall, its form flickering like a shadow made flesh. It had spoken to her, calling her the bearer of the mark. What did that mean? She had no answers, but the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The hum, the symbols, the strange feeling that had followed her since the moment she stepped foot in Salt Haven. It was all connected. When they reached the edge of the town, the first hint of dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting pale light across the old houses and the cracked streets. Salt Haven, in the morning light, looked almost serene, like a town frozen in time, unaware of the horrors lurking beneath. But Mara knew better now. There was no escaping what had been awakened. They headed to the town square, the center of the town where the old town hall stood, its stone exterior weathered by years of salt and wind. It was a place of history, where the founders had gathered and where decisions had been made, decisions that had shaped the town's future. But it also felt like the epicenter of something older, something more dangerous. If there was any place where the heart of the seal might be hidden, it was here. Mara stepped toward the steps of the town hall, her mind focused on the task ahead. We need to look around here. It's our best shot at finding something that can help us stop this. The wind picked up, the air thick with an electric charge. A storm was coming, both literal and metaphorical. Mara could feel it in her bones. The town was holding its breath, waiting for something. She could only hope they had enough time to uncover the truth before it was too late. As she approached the door to the town hall, the ground beneath her feet trembled ever so slightly. It was a small vibration at first, but the longer she stood there, the more intense it became. She glanced over at Lawrence and Agnes, but both were already staring at the building, their faces pale and tight with fear. The silence was finally broken by a sharp, cracking sound, the sound of stone breaking. The ground beneath the town hall had begun to shift, the stone steps beginning to crack and crumble, as if something deep below was awakening. The town hall, once a symbol of order, was beginning to unravel. It was then that Mara understood. They had not just been playing with forces they couldn't comprehend. They had crossed a threshold, and now the town itself was part of the ritual. The hum had returned, louder than ever before, vibrating in the bones of the town itself. The storm was coming, and it was already inside Salthaven. The storm, both physical and metaphorical, had arrived in Salthaven. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the once familiar streets now felt foreign, hostile. The air was thick with tension, heavy with an energy that seemed to pulse from deep within the earth. Mara stood frozen on the cracked steps of the town hall, her heart racing as the vibrations beneath her intensified. Something was happening. The town itself, once quaint and sleepy, was now a living entity, reacting to the awakening of forces it had kept buried for centuries. What's going on? Lawrence's voice was strained, his eyes wide with disbelief. He was looking around, his body tense, as if expecting the ground to swallow him whole. But Mara didn't have an answer. She didn't know what was happening, but she could feel it, the weight of something ancient pressing in on them. "The seal is breaking," Agnes said, her voice eerily calm. She stood a few steps away from Mara, her gaze fixed on the horizon where dark clouds swirled ominously. The town has always been tied to it. The rituals, the sacrifices, the things the founders did to keep it locked away. Now it's all coming undone. Mara turned to Agnes, her mind racing. But how? What's the connection? Why now? Agnes hesitated before answering. The founders didn't just build the town for trade or shelter. They built it around the gate, around the power that lies beneath. Salthaven was founded as a sanctuary, yes, but it was also a prison for something that shouldn't have been allowed to live in this world. Mara's breath caught in her throat. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together. The mine, the lighthouse, the hum, the visions. Everything was part of something larger, something the town's founders had tried to keep hidden. The gate they had spoken of wasn't just some ancient relic. It was a portal, a rift, and Salthaven had been built to keep it closed. But now, as the town shifted and cracked, the seal that held it shut was weakening. And that meant whatever was on the other side was getting closer. A loud crack echoed from the town hall as the doors slowly creaked open, as if inviting them inside. Mara didn't hesitate. She could feel the pull, the undeniable urge to go further, to seek the truth, even as every instinct screamed at her to run. She stepped forward, her foot landing on the first step. Lawrence followed, though more hesitantly, glancing nervously at the growing storm clouds above them. Inside the town hall, the air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. The dim light from the windows cast long shadows across the room. It was empty, save for the remnants of old furniture and weathered portraits of the town's founders. The walls, however, were the most disturbing feature. They were covered in symbols that Mara recognized from the mine, from the lighthouse, from her dreams. They were the same markings, the same glyphs that had appeared wherever the hum had been strongest. These marks, Mara whispered, stepping closer to the wall. Her fingers brushed against the cold stone, tracing the lines of one of the symbols. "They're everywhere." Agnes joined her, her eyes scanning the room. They were here long before the town was built. The founders knew what they were dealing with. These symbols were used to protect the gate, to keep whatever's on the other side from crossing over. But they didn't just seal the gate, they bound it to the town itself. The land, the water, the very air, all of it is part of the ritual. Lawrence's voice cut through the growing unease. "So what? We're trapped here? There's no way out?" Agnes turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "It's not about escape. It's about understanding what's happening. The gate is breaking, and if we don't stop it, the town will be consumed. All of Salt Haven, every person, every building, will be swallowed by whatever is waiting on the other side." Mara felt a chill run down her spine as Agnes's words sank in. She had known, deep down, that they weren't just dealing with a ghost or a curse. No, this was something far older, far more dangerous. The gate wasn't just a doorway. It was a rift between worlds, and whatever was on the other side was desperate to come through. "Where do we even start?" Mara asked, her voice small, though she knew the answer already. They had to find the source, the heart of the gate, and stop it before it tore the town and everything else apart. Agnes walked to the center of the room, where an old, worn rug covered a trapdoor in the floor. She paused, then reached down, pulling it open with ease. The air that rushed up from the depths below was cold, musty, and thick with decay. "The source is down there," Agnes said quietly. "The founders built the gate in the depths, beneath the town hall, beneath the earth itself. If we're going to stop this, we have to go down." Mara stared at the darkness below, her heart hammering in her chest. There was no turning back now. They had crossed a line, and there was no way to undo what had been set in motion. The truth was down there, in the darkness, and Mara was ready to face it, ready to stop whatever was trying to claw its way into their world. With one final glance back at Lawrence and Agnes, she descended into the darkness, knowing that whatever lay ahead would change everything. The storm had come, and there was no escaping its fury. The descent into the unknown was slower than Mara had anticipated. The air grew thicker, heavier, as if it was fighting against her every step. The dim light from their flashlights flickered as they moved further into the labyrinthine tunnels beneath Salt Haven, the walls constricting with each passing moment. The musty odor of wet stone and stale air mixed with a faint, acrid scent, something unnatural, as though the earth itself was decaying. Mara's breath was shallow, her mind racing with the weight of everything they had learned. The gate, the ancient rituals, the symbols, everything that had once seemed like fragments of a fevered nightmare was now real, tangible, and terrifying. And now they were standing on the precipice of it all. They had crossed the line between what was human and what was not. There was no returning to the life they once knew. Agnes led the way, her steps sure, despite the oppressive atmosphere that weighed down on them. Lawrence followed closely behind Mara, his face pale, but his eyes burning with a determination she hadn't seen before. In this place, this forsaken hollow beneath the town, something had awakened inside them all. This was no longer about the town's history, no longer about solving a mystery. This was about survival, about stopping something ancient and monstrous before it could engulf them all. "We're close," Agnes muttered, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the group. Her voice was almost lost amidst the echoes of their footsteps, but there was no mistaking the grim certainty in her tone. "The gate isn't just here. It's part of the town's very foundation. The deeper we go, the more it pulls at you." Mara glanced at her, uneasy. "Pulls at you?" Agnes nodded, her face tight with something akin to fear. "The gate doesn't just open. It feeds off of the land. It feeds off the people. The rituals the founders performed were meant to bind it, but that binding was fragile. Each passing year, the barrier weakened, and with every unknowing soul drawn into the town, the gate's power grew." Lawrence frowned, trying to process the gravity of her words. "You mean the whole town is built on top of it?" "Yes," Agnes replied. "Everything. The town, the mines, the lighthouse, the harbor, all of it was built atop this cursed place. The founders thought they could control it. They thought that by placing the gate deep underground, beneath layers of stone and wood, they could keep it hidden from the world. But now, Agnes stopped, and for the first time, Mara noticed the tremble in her hands. Now it's breaking through. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, and the temperature dropped abruptly. Mara wrapped her arms around herself, as though the chill was reaching into her very bones. She wasn't sure whether it was the supernatural pull of the gate itself or the creeping realization of how far they had already fallen. They weren't just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for the lives of everyone above them. Suddenly, the narrow passage opened into a vast cavern, and the air grew thicker, as if something was pressing down from above. A deep hum vibrated through the stone, reverberating in their chest, and the darkness seemed to swirl with a presence, ancient and all-encompassing. At the center of the cavern stood a massive stone altar, ancient symbols carved into its surface, glowing faintly with a sickly green light. Mara froze, her pulse quickening. The gate was here. It wasn't some ancient artifact to be studied or understood. It was a living thing, a force that breathed and pulsed with an energy that was far beyond human comprehension. The altar, Agnes whispered. It's the heart of the gate, the place where the boundary between worlds is the weakest. Mara stepped forward, drawn toward the altar as though the stone itself was calling to her. She could feel the hum deep in her bones, the presence pressing against her consciousness, pushing against her sanity. And then she saw it, a figure, barely perceptible, standing just beyond the altar, a shadow barely human. Her heart skipped a beat, and her breath caught in her throat. The figure was familiar, but she couldn't place it. Then, it took a step forward, and Mara's mind recoiled in horror as the figure's face came into view. It was Lawrence. No, not Lawrence. It looked like him, but the eyes were wrong. Black, like endless pits, hollow and soulless. The skin was pale, too pale, and the expression twisted in a way that was far beyond any human form. This wasn't Lawrence, but something that had taken his shape, his very essence. Mara stumbled back, her voice barely a whisper. "Lawrence, no, you're—" The thing smiled, a twisted mockery of the man she had known. "No," it whispered, its voice low and hollow. "Not Lawrence. Not anymore." It was then that the full weight of their situation hit Mara like a physical blow. They hadn't just been investigating a curse. They hadn't just stumbled upon a forgotten town secret. They had unleashed something ancient, something that had been waiting for centuries to break free. And now, it was wearing the guise of someone they trusted, someone they needed. The figure advanced slowly, and the hum grew louder, more insistent. The gate wasn't just a doorway. It was a living creature, feeding on the very fabric of their world. And it had begun to bleed through. The altar wasn't just a symbol. It was a conduit, a link between their world and whatever lay beyond. Mara took a step back, her mind racing. She couldn't fight this thing, not with brute force. There was no weapon powerful enough. The answer, she realized, wasn't in confrontation, it was in understanding. She needed to stop the ritual, to sever the connection. But to do that, she had to face the truth. The gate wasn't just something buried beneath the town. It was part of everything. The town itself was the prison, and it was crumbling. If they didn't act now, it would collapse, and everything in Salt Haven, everything in this world, would be consumed. The figure, or what had once been Lawrence, stopped just before the altar. It tilted its head, as if sensing Mara's resolve. "You think you can stop it?" it rasped. "You think you can stop what's already been set in motion?" Mara squared her shoulders, the weight of her fear replaced by a cold, determined focus. "I have to." The hum grew deafening, and for a moment, she felt as if the world around her was dissolving into chaos. But one thing was certain: whatever came next, she would face it head-on. There was no turning back now. Mara's mind was reeling. The figure in front of her, Lawrence, or what had once been Lawrence, stood motionless, its twisted features fixed in a grotesque semblance of a smile. It was as though the man she had known had been reduced to a mere puppet, with the puppet master being the unseen force behind the gate itself. Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the situation sinking deeper with each passing second. The air was thick, the presence of the ancient evil pressing against her mind like an oppressive weight. It felt as if the very stone beneath her feet was alive, waiting to consume her. Despite the suffocating dread, Mara's thoughts sharpened. She had to keep moving. There was no other choice. The first steps were always the hardest, and she had already taken them. There was no going back now. "You're not Lawrence," Mara whispered, though it was as much a statement to herself as it was to the creature before her. "Whatever you are, whatever this is, I won't let it take us." The figure's smile widened, revealing teeth far too sharp, far too white. The light from their flashlights flickered as it spoke, its voice reverberating with an otherworldly distortion. "Do you truly believe you can stop it? The gate is already open. It has already begun to consume everything around you. You, your town, your world. None of it will be left. Not even you." The words hung in the air, thick with malevolent certainty. Mara's hands clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. Lawrence's form, it wasn't him, but it was undeniably connected to him. His likeness had been hijacked, taken by the force that had been festering beneath Salthaven for centuries. The creature was a physical manifestation of that force, its power surging through every inch of the cavern. Behind her, she could hear Agnes and Lawrence. Her Lawrence, breathing heavily, their footsteps faltering. They were just as affected by the creature's presence, their bodies responding to its unnatural power. But Mara couldn't afford to think about them now. She couldn't allow herself to be distracted. She had to fight this thing, to stop whatever ritual had allowed it to break free of the boundaries set so long ago. "We can't stop it by running," Mara said, her voice steadying. "We have to destroy the gate. If we don't, this thing, whatever it is, will keep coming for us, for everyone." Agnes moved forward, her face pale but resolute. "You're right. The gate's power doesn't just pull things from another world. It's a drain. It takes everything from the people who live near it, feeding off their energy until there's nothing left." She turned to look at Mara, her eyes wide with the weight of what she was about to say. "The gate was meant to be sealed, buried. But we've disturbed it. Now it's reaching out. We have to close it, or it will consume us all." The creature chuckled, a sound that made Mara's skin crawl. "You think you can close it? You cannot undo what has been done. The rituals of your founders were nothing but a temporary stopgap. The gate was always meant to open. You will become part of it, like the others." Mara shuddered at the thought. She could hear the anguish in the voice of the thing that had once worn Lawrence's face. She couldn't let it win, couldn't allow the town, or the people she loved, to be consumed by the darkness it brought. With a sudden clarity, Mara turned her attention back to the altar. The symbols etched into the stone glowed faintly, shifting in ways that defied logic. It wasn't just the gate itself that needed to be sealed. The altar was a part of it, a physical anchor that allowed the gate to maintain its presence in their world. If they were to close it, they had to destroy the altar. But even as she considered it, the air around them seemed to thicken, as though the very cavern was alive, resisting her thoughts, pulling her down into despair. It felt like the walls were closing in, the ground beneath her feet quaking ever so slightly. The gate had begun its reclamation of the town, and this place was the heart of it. Mara knew that destroying the altar might be the only way to stop it. But to do so would mean confronting not just the ancient evil that lurked there, but also the people she had grown up with, the people she loved. Agnes stepped forward, her voice low but urgent. "We have to be careful. The gate won't just give up without a fight. We have to sever the connection. We can't just destroy the altar. It's tied to the land itself." Mara nodded, the plan forming in her mind. "Then we need to destroy the anchors. The symbols. Anything that ties this place to Salthaven." The creature's form shimmered and distorted as it laughed again. "You think you can stop it? You think you can erase what is already written? The town was always meant to be a sacrifice. And now, the end is here." Mara stepped forward, her resolve hardening. She didn't know how, but she would fight. She wouldn't let the town be consumed. She wouldn't let the people she cared about become part of this nightmare. As she approached the altar, she heard the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks outside, a haunting reminder of the town's connection to the sea. The ocean had always been a source of life for Salthaven, but now it felt like a warning, a reminder that the water, too, was becoming part of the abyss. The ocean was changing, and it wasn't just the town's fate that hung in the balance. With a sudden surge of strength, Mara pulled a shard of metal from her pocket, the fragment of the old ceremonial knife they had found in the lighthouse. She held it tightly in her hand, feeling the cold steel bite into her palm. It was time to make the choice, time to fight the darkness that had claimed Salthaven. And then, as the air grew heavier, and the cavern seemed to pulse with the power of the gate, Mara understood. The gate wasn't just a doorway to another world. It was a mirror, a reflection of the town's deepest fears, its darkest secrets, and its most desperate desires. To close it, they would have to confront everything they had buried in Salthaven. They would have to face the past. But could they? Mara stood before the altar, clutching the shard of metal tightly in her hand. Her fingers were raw, the jagged edges of the shard cutting into her skin as if the blade itself was rejecting her touch. The creature, once Lawrence, loomed before her, its mocking smile still fixed on its distorted face, as if it had already won. The oppressive weight of the cave pressed in on her, each breath feeling heavier than the last. But she couldn't stop now. She couldn't afford to let it win. Salthaven's fate, and perhaps her own, hung in the balance. The sounds of the crashing waves outside seemed to grow louder, a haunting reminder of the connection between the town and the ocean that had always defined it. Salthaven had been built on the coast, its foundation built on the belief that the sea was both a provider and a protector. But now, the ocean felt like an ever-present threat, as if it too had begun to shift under the dark influence of the gate. The town had lived in ignorance for so long, blind to the dark forces lurking beneath the surface. But Mara knew now that it wasn't just the town that was in danger, it was everything. Behind her, Agnes and Lawrence, the real Lawrence, stood in silence. They were just as trapped as she was, caught between the horrors of the past and the darkness of the present. Agnes' face was pale, her eyes haunted as if she had already seen the outcome, as if she knew the cost of what was to come. Lawrence, on the other hand, stood still, his face empty, as if the fight had already drained him of all emotion. He had been through so much already, but Mara couldn't help but wonder if this was something beyond what they had prepared for. The figure of Lawrence, or the thing wearing his face, spoke again, its voice unnaturally calm. You cannot undo what was done. You cannot escape the pact that has bound this town to the abyss. Your ancestors chose this path, and now you must pay the price. Mara's grip on the shard tightened, her heart hammering in her chest. She had to silence it. The creature's words, twisted with ancient knowledge, seemed to crawl under her skin. They were right in a way. The people of Salthaven had made their deal with the darkness long ago. The founders had set up the gate, thinking it would keep the evil contained. They had believed that by offering sacrifices, they could prevent the abyss from spilling over into the world. But they had failed. The ritual had never truly worked. And now, the very forces they had sought to control had returned to claim what was theirs. The realization hit Mara with the force of a tidal wave. Salthaven had never been free of the curse. The town was built on a lie. The people had lived their lives, ignorant of the pact their ancestors had made, thinking the rituals were a thing of the past. But now, the gates were open, and the town was once again at the mercy of the forces they had tried to lock away. The past had never left Salthaven. It had always been there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The town's history, its mistakes, had caught up with them. Mara thought of the people she had known all her life, the friends and family who had never questioned the town's strange traditions, who had never wondered why the town was so isolated from the world. They had simply accepted it. But now it was too late for questions. The answers they needed were buried deep in the past, in the very foundation of the town itself. As she looked at the altar, the symbols etched into its stone glowed brighter, almost as if reacting to her thoughts. They twisted and writhed, the shapes shifting into something more familiar, something that felt like it was connected to her own memories. Her mind flashed back to the stories her grandmother had told her, Stories of strange happenings in the town's early days, stories of sacrifices made to keep the sea at bay, to keep the darkness from overwhelming them all. Her grandmother had always spoken of the old days with a mixture of fear and reverence, warning Mara to never stray too far from the paths that had been set by the town's founders. But Mara had dismissed it, thinking those were just old superstitions, stories meant to keep children in line. But now, standing in the heart of the very evil that had shaped the town's existence, Mara realized the truth. The darkness had always been a part of Salt Haven. It was a part of her, a part of every person who lived here. A shiver ran down her spine as the realization sank in. The gate wasn't just a doorway to another world. It was a mirror, a reflection of everything the town had buried, every secret it had kept. The evil that had once been locked away had never truly been contained. It had merely been waiting for the right moment to break free. And now that moment had come. Mara turned to Agnes, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "We have to close it. We have to destroy it, or everything is lost." Agnes nodded slowly, her face drawn with exhaustion but resolute. "The only way to close it is to sever its connection to the land. We have to destroy the anchors, the symbols, the stones, everything. But it's not just the gate that's feeding off this place. It's the people, Mara. The town itself is connected to the darkness. If we destroy the gate, we may destroy everything that Salt Haven is built on." Mara swallowed hard. She had always loved Salt Haven, despite its strange history. It was home, but home had never been what she thought it was. And now, in order to save it, she might have to destroy everything she had ever known. The thought filled her with a deep, soul-wrenching sadness. But it was the only choice. They had no other option. The past had caught up with them, and they were the only ones who could stop it. Mara turned back to face the altar, the shard of metal trembling in her hand. She was ready. She had no other choice. The darkness that had shaped the town's fate had to be stopped, no matter the cost. The world around Mara seemed to freeze as she stood before the altar, her grip tightening on the shard of metal. The weight of what was about to happen pressed down on her chest, heavy and suffocating. Her mind raced, scrambling for a solution, a way out of the impossible situation she found herself in. But there was no escaping it. The choice had been made long ago, and now she was bound to see it through, whether she was ready or not. Salt Haven had always been a place of contradictions, a town built on an oceanic dream that was shadowed by the darkness beneath. Over the years, Mara had come to realize that nothing in Salt Haven was ever as it seemed. The town's prosperity, its isolation, and even its people all came at a price. The heavy fog that often rolled in from the sea was a perfect metaphor for the secrets that the town's inhabitants had long buried. She had spent her life trying to ignore the stories, the old folklore, the rumors of cursed land and haunted waters. But now, standing at the heart of the abyss, she could no longer deny that those stories had been true. Lawrence, the real Lawrence, stood beside her, his face weary but resolute. His presence had been a constant source of strength, even when it seemed like all hope was lost. He was a reminder that there was still something worth fighting for. He had lost so much already, his own sense of self, his family, and his peace of mind. Yet, here he was, standing next to Mara as if their fates had always been tied together. In many ways, they had always been connected, bound by the secrets of Salt Haven and the blood that had been spilled to keep its demons at bay. Agnes, too, was there, her silent expression betraying the storm raging inside her. She had always known more than she had let on, always seemed to understand the gravity of their situation long before Mara had. But Agnes had her own demons. Her connection to the darkness was as much a part of her as the blood running through her veins. She had witnessed the horrors of the past and understood the true cost of what was about to happen. She had lived in the shadows of the town for far too long, always on the edge of the truth, but never fully able to face it. The creature, the twisted version of Lawrence, stood opposite them, its smile widening with every passing second, as if it reveled in their suffering. It spoke with a voice that echoed through Mara's very bones. "You think you can destroy what has been woven into the very fabric of this place? You think you can undo what was written in the blood of your ancestors? Foolish children. Mara's blood ran cold as she locked eyes with the creature. There was no way forward but through it. The shard in her hand pulsed with energy, as if it was calling to her, beckoning her to do what needed to be done. But the cost of destroying the gate, the cost of closing the door to the abyss, was something she wasn't prepared for. She had never asked for any of this. She had never asked to bear the burden of Salthaven's past. But it didn't matter. The town's survival was now in her hands. Everything you've fought for, the creature continued, its voice dripping with malice, will be lost. Your town, your family, your very souls will be consumed. You cannot fight what is inevitable. You're already too far gone. Mara's heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she faltered. The creature's words were like a poison, seeping into her thoughts, planting seeds of doubt. It was true. She had never asked for this. She had never wanted to be the one to face down the ancient evil that had haunted her town for centuries. But it was too late to turn back now. She had already seen too much. The path forward, however uncertain, was the only path left. Beside her, Agnes let out a slow breath, almost as if she had been expecting this moment. "The darkness is within all of us," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "But we don't have to succumb to it. We don't have to let it define us." Mara looked at Agnes, seeing the pain etched into her face. She understood now. The evil that had taken root in Salthaven wasn't just the result of a few cursed ancestors. It was a reflection of the town itself. The people who had chosen to ignore the signs, the ones who had buried the truth for so long. The evil was not just an outside force. It was a part of them all. And now, they were being given one final chance to rid themselves of it. But the price for that freedom would be steep. Mara's chest tightened as she realized the full extent of what had happened. She turned to Lawrence, his expression mirroring her own uncertainty. They both knew what needed to be done, and yet, neither of them could fully grasp the weight of the decision they were about to make. They would destroy the gate, sever its connection to the town, and close the doorway to the abyss once and for all. But the cost would be more than just the loss of a physical structure. They would lose everything: their connection to Salthaven, their ties to the place they had once called home. "I'm ready," Mara whispered, though the words barely felt like her own. She was no longer sure who she was anymore. She had come to Salthaven a different person, innocent, unaware of the darkness that had always been there. But now she was someone else, someone shaped by the horrors she had faced, someone who had seen the true cost of silence and ignorance. The creature laughed, a sound that echoed off the walls of the cave like the call of a vengeful god. "You think you are ready? You're already lost. You have been lost since the moment you stepped into this place." Mara closed her eyes and raised the shard of metal high, feeling the pulse of its energy hum in her palm. She could feel it, her connection to the land, to the sea, to the very history of Salthaven. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival anymore. She was fighting for the survival of every person who had ever lived in this town, every person who had been unknowingly complicit in the sins of the past. It wasn't just the gate that needed to be destroyed. It was the curse itself. She could feel it, the power building inside her as the shard began to glow with an otherworldly light. She could hear the creature's voice fading into the background, its mocking tone growing more distant. This was it. This was the moment. There was no going back. Mara took a deep breath and drove the shard into the altar, her heart racing with anticipation and dread. The ground shook, the air crackled with energy, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to stop. Then, as the altar began to crumble, the true price of her actions became clear. Salthaven was dying, but perhaps in its death, it would be reborn. Mara didn't know if she would ever see the town she had once known again. But she knew this. Salthaven's curse had been lifted, and its long, dark history had come to an end. Whatever came next, she was ready. The dust had barely settled after the final confrontation at the altar, and yet Mara felt as though the world was unraveling before her eyes. Salthaven, the town that had defined her existence, was now a shell of its former self. What had been a thriving coastal town, bustling with fishermen, traders, and dreamers, now lay silent, like a place forgotten by time. The streets were empty, save for the occasional gust of wind that carried with it the scent of salt and decay. The once pristine shoreline, where children used to play and lovers strolled at sunset, was now a barren wasteland of jagged rocks and lifeless seaweed. The sea, once a symbol of life, now seemed more like a predator, watching and waiting. Mara had done it. She had closed the gate, severed the connection to the abyss that had haunted the town for centuries. The creature was gone, its laughter fading into the ether. But in doing so, she had unleashed something far more insidious than she had ever anticipated. The very fabric of Salt Haven had been torn apart, and what remained was a place caught between life and death. It was as though the town had been erased from existence, its soul stripped away. Lawrence had remained by her side, though his presence was more a quiet reassurance than anything else. He had been the one to remind her that they were in this together. But Mara could see the toll the destruction had taken on him as well. He was no longer the man she had met all those months ago. His once bright eyes were now hollow, his face drawn with exhaustion. The horrors they had witnessed had changed him, and perhaps they had changed her too. In their shared silence, she could feel the weight of the loss hanging between them, of family, of love, of everything they had known. Agnes, on the other hand, had disappeared. It wasn't surprising. She had always been the enigma, the one who danced on the edge of understanding but never fully embraced the truth. Mara couldn't blame her for leaving. Agnes had always known more than she let on, and perhaps she had known what was coming all along. The curse had been broken, yes, but it had come with a price. And now, that price had to be paid. The town had been abandoned by its people. What few remained seemed to wander aimlessly, their eyes glazed over as though they were no longer fully aware of their surroundings. The fog that had once been a constant companion had receded, but it had left behind a palpable sense of unease. People seemed to avoid each other, no longer able to look one another in the eye. It was as if the town had lost its heartbeat, its rhythm, and without it, nothing could grow. Mara walked the empty streets alone, unsure of where she was headed. She had been here before, of course, but this place was different now. Every building, every shop, every corner seemed foreign to her, as though she had stepped into a parallel universe. The familiar had become alien, and the alien had become familiar. She could no longer distinguish the line between reality and something darker, something twisted that lingered just beneath the surface. As she passed by the old lighthouse, a faint sound reached her ears, an echo of something, perhaps a voice, but distorted. It sent a chill down her spine. The lighthouse, once a symbol of guidance for sailors lost in the fog, now stood as a monument to lost hope. Its light no longer shone, its beacon extinguished. Mara couldn't help but feel that the lighthouse was trying to tell her something. It had always been a landmark of safety, but now it seemed to represent something else, something far more sinister. She approached the lighthouse, driven by an inexplicable urge to investigate. There, in the shadow of the decaying tower, Mara saw a figure standing motionless. The person was silhouetted against the backdrop of the dying sun, their outline almost ghostly in the fading light. For a moment, she wondered if it was one of the town's lost souls, trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead. But as she drew closer, she recognized the figure. It was Lawrence. His eyes were distant, his posture rigid. He was staring out at the horizon, as though waiting for something to emerge from the sea. Mara called out to him, but he didn't respond. She approached him slowly, afraid of what she might find. He turned to face her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, his gaze seemed to focus on her. But there was something wrong with his expression. It was as if he were looking at her from a great distance, as though he no longer recognized her. "Mara," he said, his voice hoarse, "it's happening. The town is fading. We're all fading." Mara felt a knot form in her stomach. She had feared this moment. They had closed the gate, but had they truly stopped the darkness? Or had they merely delayed the inevitable? She reached out to touch Lawrence's arm, but as her fingers brushed his skin, it felt cold, lifeless. "It's not over, is it?" Mara asked, her voice trembling. Lawrence shook his head slowly, his eyes now fully clouded with sorrow. "No, Mara, it's not over. We thought we had won, but the curse wasn't just the gate. The curse was the land itself. It was everything. We can't escape it. We can't outrun it." The realization hit Mara like a tidal wave. The curse wasn't contained within the gate. It was woven into the very fabric of Salt Haven, embedded in its soil, in its history, in the blood of its people. Closing the gate had been a necessary step, but it hadn't been enough. They hadn't destroyed the source. They had only delayed the inevitable. Salt Haven's doom was tied to its foundation, and now the town was beginning to die in earnest. Mara felt the ground beneath her tremble. The lighthouse began to shake, its walls groaning under an unseen pressure. It was as though the very town itself was in pain. Lawrence took a step back, his face pale as the realization set in. "Then what do we do?" Mara asked, desperation creeping into her voice. Lawrence's eyes darkened. "We do what we should have done long ago. We finish what we started." Mara stared at him, a sense of dread creeping into her soul. She had always known the fight wasn't truly over, but now it seemed that the final battle was upon them. The town was slipping into oblivion, and they were its last hope. But hope was a fragile thing, and she wasn't sure how much of it was left. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the lighthouse and the town in darkness. And in that darkness, Mara realized that the real battle had just begun. The curse of Salt Haven had never been about the gate. It had always been about the town itself. Salt Haven had always been a town defined by its history, and perhaps that was its greatest curse. Every corner, every building, and every shadow seemed to carry the weight of a forgotten past that refused to stay buried. In the weeks that followed the disaster at the lighthouse, Mara found herself increasingly drawn to the town's hidden corners, places where the whispers of the past still lingered like ghosts. It was as if the town itself was trying to communicate, to reveal something that had been hidden for far too long. The eerie silence that had settled over the streets was now punctuated by strange occurrences. People, or what was left of them, moved in the periphery of her vision, their faces obscured by the mist. Some appeared to be lost in thought, walking the streets as though they had been frozen in time. Others simply stood in place, staring into the distance as if waiting for a signal that never came. They were no longer the vibrant, lively people of Salt Haven, but rather hollow versions of themselves, trapped in a purgatory they did not understand. Mara couldn't shake the feeling that the town was slipping further into a dreamlike state, where reality was no longer solid but fluid, malleable. It was as if she were walking through the ruins of a memory, unable to tell if she was in the present or a distant past. She had never been one to believe in superstitions or the paranormal, but something about Salt Haven had always unsettled her. The place had always seemed to hold its breath, like a creature waiting to pounce. Now, that feeling was unbearable. It was on one of these walks through the crumbling remains of the town's old district that Mara came across the town's oldest building, a decaying mansion that had once belonged to the town's founders. The mansion had always been a symbol of Salt Haven's wealthy past, a reminder of the days when the town had flourished as a port town, its coffers filled with the riches of the sea. But now, it was a crumbling relic, overtaken by ivy and decay. It had been abandoned for as long as Mara could remember, a place that locals avoided out of superstition. It was said to be cursed, though no one could say why. Drawn by an inexplicable force, Mara crossed the threshold of the mansion. The door creaked open, revealing a grand foyer, shrouded in darkness. The air inside was thick with dust, and the faint scent of mildew lingered. The grandeur of the place was still evident, despite the ravages of time. Ornate chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their crystals long since dulled. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. The house felt alive, as though it were breathing with her. As she moved deeper into the mansion, Mara felt the temperature drop. A chill settled in her bones, and she could almost hear the faint whispers of voices in the distance. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but as she moved forward, the whispers grew louder. They weren't the natural sounds of wind or creaking wood. They were voices, faint but unmistakable. Mara paused, listening intently. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably urgent, filled with desperation. The voices seemed to guide her toward the back of the mansion, where a narrow staircase led to the basement. Without thinking, she descended, her feet heavy on the creaking steps. The darkness was oppressive here, almost suffocating. But as she reached the bottom, something stopped her cold. A faint light flickered in the far corner, casting long shadows against the walls. There, on the floor, lay an old chest, its wood warped and scarred by time. The chest was covered in symbols, intricate carvings that Mara could not recognize, but they seemed to pulse with a strange energy. She approached cautiously, her heartbeat quickening. The symbols on the chest seemed to glow faintly, almost as if they were alive. She reached out to touch them, and the moment her fingers brushed against the surface, the air in the room grew heavy. A cold, unnatural wind swept through the basement, extinguishing the faint light and plunging the room into darkness. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by a deep, guttural sound, like the growl of a predator. In that moment, Mara realized with terrifying clarity that she had found the source, the heart of Salthaven's curse. The mansion, the town, the darkness that had spread like a disease through every street and every home, it was all tied to this place, to this chest. It was as if the town itself had been built upon a lie that had been kept hidden for generations. The founding families, the town's prosperity, its rise and fall, none of it had been as it seemed. And now, Mara was standing at the center of it all, the point where the town's history and its darkest secrets converged. The whispers became deafening, and Mara stepped back, her mind racing. She had to leave, had to break free from the pull of the chest, but it was too late. The shadows in the basement seemed to move, twisting and reaching toward her. Panic surged through her chest, but as she turned to flee, the door to the basement slammed shut. Mara was trapped. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the growling sound grew louder, now mixed with a chorus of disembodied voices, all crying out in agony. With nowhere left to run, Mara did the only thing she could think to do. She reached in her bag and pulled out the artifact, the strange object she had found in the lighthouse. She didn't know if it would work, if it would do anything at all, but she had to try. Holding it in her trembling hands, she whispered the words she had heard from the voices. The air around her seemed to shimmer, and the growling noise suddenly stopped. Silence fell, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of something waiting. As the dust settled, Mara could feel the weight of the mansion's history pressing down on her, suffocating her. She had come here seeking answers, but all she had found was more questions. The town's curse was not just a story of monsters and ghosts. It was a story of deception, of a town built on blood and sacrifice. And now Mara was bound to it. Whether she wanted to be or not, she was a part of Salthaven's history, and the echoes of the past would never let her forget it. Mara's breath came in shallow, erratic gasps as she stumbled away from the chest. The weight of what she had uncovered in the mansion's basement pressed down on her chest like a physical force, suffocating her with each passing moment. Her mind raced, struggling to piece together the fragments of her discovery. The artifact, the voices, the shadows. Everything seemed to be part of a puzzle she could no longer ignore. But even as she stood there, frozen in the haunting silence of the basement, Mara realized that there was no turning back. She had crossed a line, and now the town's dark history was bound to her in a way that could not be undone. When she finally managed to collect herself, Mara's first instinct was to leave, to escape the mansion and put as much distance between herself and the chest as possible. But she knew it wouldn't be that simple. Salthaven was no longer the town she had once known. It was a place distorted by the past, a place where the fabric of reality had begun to unravel, and the past was bleeding into the present. The whispers that had followed her in the mansion were not just voices. They were warnings. Mara had to understand what they meant before it was too late. The air outside was thick with fog as Mara made her way back to her small cabin. The town had taken on an unsettling stillness, as though it, too, were holding its breath. She couldn't help but notice how the buildings appeared to lean in on her, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to twist in unnatural ways. It was as if the town itself was watching her, waiting for her to make her next move. The streets were eerily deserted. No people, no sounds, just the oppressive silence that had become the hallmark of Salt Haven. As she walked, Mara's thoughts returned to the artifact in her bag. What was it? Why had she been drawn to it in the first place? Was it merely a coincidence that it had appeared in her possession just before the madness of the lighthouse had begun to unfold? Her grip tightened around the object, her fingers curling against its cold surface. She didn't know the answers, but she felt an undeniable connection to it. The artifact seemed to pulse with a strange energy, a kind of urgency that called to her. That night, as Mara sat alone in her cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. She had known it the moment she had stepped into the mansion, and now, in the quiet of her home, the sensation had only intensified. The town was shifting, twisting, as if the very ground beneath her feet was being pulled into a vortex. She needed to find the answers to the questions that plagued her, but she knew that doing so would not be easy. Salt Haven was a town built on secrets, and those secrets were not easily unearthed. The artifact, she realized, was no ordinary object. It wasn't just a relic from the past, it was a key to something much older, something that had been buried beneath the town for centuries. The whispers she had heard, the ones that had guided her to the mansion's basement, had spoken of a great power that lay dormant, a power that could either save the town or destroy it. The burden of that knowledge was heavy, and Mara knew she couldn't carry it alone. She thought of the townspeople, the ones who had appeared so lifeless and lost. They were the ones most affected by the town's curse, the ones who had felt its weight for generations. The history of Salt Haven was inextricably linked to the artifact, and Mara's discovery had set in motion forces she could not fully comprehend. If she was to find a way to break the cycle of suffering, she would need help. But whom could she trust? The answers, she realized, might lie in the old town records. Hidden in the dusty shelves of the town hall was a collection of journals, letters, and documents, artifacts in their own right, that chronicled Salt Haven's earliest days. The town's founding families had left behind a trail of clues, but it was up to Mara to follow them. She had no idea what she would find, but she knew that the truth was there, buried beneath layers of time and secrecy. The following day, Mara visited the town hall. The building was even older than she had imagined, its stone walls crumbling with age. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and old paper, and the dim light from the few remaining windows only added to the oppressive atmosphere. She made her way to the back, where the town's archives were stored. The room was vast, filled with rows of shelves that reached toward the high ceiling, each one packed with the weight of history. Mara spent hours poring over the records, scanning old journals and faded documents. It was tedious work, and much of what she read seemed irrelevant or mundane. But then, buried in a box at the back of one shelf, she found a journal that made her pause. It was an old, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. As she flipped through the pages, Mara's eyes widened. The journal belonged to one of Salt Haven's original founders, Jasper Blackwell, the man whose family had built the mansion she had explored the previous day. Blackwell's journal chronicled his experiences in founding Salt Haven, but there was something more sinister lurking between the lines. He spoke of strange rituals, sacrifices made in exchange for prosperity, and dark forces that had been unleashed in the town's early years. The more Mara read, the more she realized that the artifact she had found was not just a key. It was part of a larger puzzle, one that had been carefully hidden for centuries. The journal spoke of a great reckoning, a day when the town's sins would catch up with it, and the curse that had been laid upon the land would finally come to fruition. It seemed that Mara had stumbled into something far more dangerous than she had ever anticipated. Salt Haven's past was not just a collection of old stories. It was alive, and it was waiting to claim her. With trembling hands, Mara closed the journal and leaned back in her chair, the weight of what she had learned sinking in. The burden of knowledge was too great to bear alone, but she had no choice. The town's fate, and perhaps her own, was in her hands. And as much as she wanted to escape, Mara knew that Salt Haven's curse would never let her go. She was tied to it, and there was no way out. Mara's heart thudded in her chest as she stood in the town square, holding the journal close to her. The weight of the knowledge she had uncovered hung over her like a storm cloud, darkening her every thought. The town had become a place of dread, a place where the veil between the living and the forgotten had thinned. It was clear now that Salt Haven was not just a town. It was a living entity, its fate inextricably tied to the people who had once called it home. In the weeks since her discovery of the journal, Mara had tried to piece together the fragments of history. She had revisited the mansion, the archives, even spoken to the few remaining elders in the town, hoping for answers. Yet, every encounter, every piece of evidence, seemed to lead her deeper into the labyrinth of Salt Haven's cursed past. Each step she took, the town seemed to change. Streets once familiar were now unfamiliar, shadows stretching longer than they should, buildings decaying at an alarming rate. Mara could no longer pretend that what was happening was a series of isolated events. It was all connected, and it was growing worse. The town's inhabitants, too, had become strangers in their own home. Their faces, once full of life, now wore a dull, lifeless expression. They moved like automatons through their daily routines, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the dark force that had descended upon them. It was as if the curse that had bound Salt Haven to its bloody history was beginning to consume the very essence of its people, erasing their will, their purpose. Mara could not even bring herself to speak to them. It was as though the curse had infected their very souls, and the moment they crossed her path, it would latch onto her as well. Mara's only hope lay in finding the truth of the great reckoning Jasper Blackwell had written about in his journal. The reckoning was coming, and the signs were undeniable. The first of many tremors had rattled the town's foundations weeks ago, followed by an unnatural fog that now clung to the streets every evening. The sun had become dimmer, as though it were losing its ability to reach the town. And worst of all, the voices that had once whispered from the shadows had grown louder. It was the voices that truly terrified Mara. At first, they had been a faint murmur, words just beyond her comprehension, barely audible under the normal noise of the world. But now, they seemed to echo from every direction, calling her name, telling her to return to the mansion, to finish what had been started. There were times when she thought she could hear them in her sleep, their murmurs twisting into her dreams. The voices had become insistent, almost frantic. There was no mistaking it now. The reckoning had begun, and she had no choice but to face it head-on. Mara's pulse quickened as she walked down the street toward the mansion, the place where it had all started. The fog was thicker than usual tonight, swirling in the air like a sentient being. It seemed to follow her every step, clinging to her skin, choking the air from her lungs. The mansion loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring down at her. Despite everything she had learned, despite the dread that weighed heavy on her, Mara knew she had to return. The truth was waiting for her inside, and she could no longer afford to ignore it. As she entered the mansion, the air grew colder. The once grand staircase was now a twisted shadow of its former self, its wood rotting and splintering beneath her feet. The walls, once adorned with portraits of proud ancestors, were now covered in layers of grime and decay. But it wasn't just the physical decay that unsettled Mara. It was the feeling of presence that filled the space. It was as though the house itself were alive, watching, waiting for her to make her move. In the center of the mansion, the chest still sat on the floor, just as it had been the day Mara first uncovered it. The dim light cast strange, shifting shadows around it, and the whispers from earlier seemed to reverberate from the very walls. Mara took a deep breath, steeling herself. She had come this far, and she couldn't turn back now. The artifact, the key, was all that stood between the town's salvation or its final descent into madness. Her hands trembled as she approached the chest. She reached down, but before she could touch it, a violent tremor shook the mansion, rattling the foundation beneath her. The walls groaned, and the floor beneath her feet seemed to twist as though it were alive. Mara staggered, her heart racing as she tried to steady herself. The house was waking up, and the reckoning had begun in earnest. From the corner of her eye, Mara saw movement. Figures, dark, shifting shapes, emerged from the walls, from the very air itself. At first, they seemed like phantoms, barely visible in the dim light. But as they drew closer, their faces became clear. The inhabitants of Salt Haven, their features twisted in agony, their eyes, empty and soulless, began to converge on her. They moved with purpose, as if they were drawn to the artifact, to the chest. Mara's breath caught in her throat. The reckoning was not just about the town, it was about her. She had been chosen to bear the burden of its curse, to make the final choice. The chest, the artifact, the voices, they were all part of the same dark design. The truth was undeniable now. Mara was the key to Salt Haven's fate. But what choice did she have? If she left, the town would continue to die. The curse would only grow stronger. If she stayed, the reckoning would consume her, just as it had consumed everyone else. As the figures closed in, their hands reaching for her, Mara felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She could feel the pull of the chest, the dark force that had been waiting for her all along. It was as though the mansion itself had been built with the purpose of drawing her back, to claim her soul. The reckoning had come, and it was time for Mara to choose, to stand against the curse or to succumb to it, just as the others had before her. The final choice was hers alone. Mara stood alone in the decaying mansion, her breath ragged as she faced the horrors closing in on her. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices urging her in every direction. Salt Haven, the town she had once known and loved, was no more. It had become a twisted, decaying shell, and she was its final hope. But what was hope when the very air seemed to pulse with dread, and when every part of the town's history pointed to an inescapable fate? The chest, still sitting ominously at the center of the room, felt like an anchor in the storm. Every instinct screamed for her to destroy it, to flee, to run as far away from this forsaken place as possible. Yet, the chest's presence was undeniable. It was the heart of Salt Haven's curse, and it was pulling her in with an invisible force that she could not escape. Mara had come this far, and she knew, with chilling clarity, that there was no going back. The reckoning had come, and it was not just the town's destruction at stake, it was hers too. As the figures of the lost townspeople moved closer, Mara's thoughts raced. How had it all come to this? How had this small coastal town become so deeply entrenched in darkness? The curse had begun long before her arrival, long before she even knew Salt Haven existed. It was ancient, rooted in blood and betrayal, festering for generations. The journal had revealed it, but even its words had only scratched the surface of a story too horrific for Mara to fully comprehend. Yet, there was no mistaking the truth now. Salt Haven was a place of death, a place where the living and the dead were forever entwined, and no one who entered could ever leave untouched. In the last few weeks, Mara had found herself slipping between two realities. The town was fading, as if being erased by time itself. Yet the figures of its cursed inhabitants remained, trapped between this world and the next. Their eyes were hollow, their faces twisted in silent screams, and their presence was suffocating. They had been here for far too long, part of the town's twisted history, never able to move on. And now, they were calling to Mara, no longer as people, but as a part of the curse, as though her very existence was tied to theirs. The chest seemed to hum with energy now, as though it were alive, its surface pulsing with an eerie glow. Mara took a step forward, hesitating. Every part of her wanted to run, to escape the pull of this madness, but she couldn't. She had come to understand that she was not a mere observer in Salt Haven's tragedy. She was part of it. The curse was hers to either carry or destroy, but in the end, there was no escaping it. The voices had led her here, to this moment, and now the time for action had arrived. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing the cool surface of the chest. A surge of energy shot through her, and for a moment, Everything around her seemed to vanish. The mansion, the fog, the town, everything melted away, leaving only darkness. In the silence that followed, Mara felt as though she were floating in the void, suspended in time. She could hear the voices clearly now, not whispers but clear, articulate words. They were no longer disembodied echoes but clear messages, fragments of lives lost to the curse. "End it," a voice said, sharp and commanding. It was the voice of Jasper Blackwell, the one who had written the journal, the man whose fate had been sealed by his own dark pact. "You are the one who must end it. There is no other way." But even as the words resonated within her, Mara felt the weight of them pressing on her chest. She was no savior. She was just a woman caught in a nightmare far larger than she could have imagined. Yet, the truth was undeniable. The curse had been waiting for her, and it was time for the final choice. The walls of the mansion returned with a rush of sound, and the figures of the lost townspeople surrounded her once more, their eyes fixed on her with a mixture of desperation and hopelessness. They were waiting for her to decide, to choose. Should she use the chest to break the curse, to release them from their eternal torment, even at the cost of her own life? Or should she leave them, let them fade into oblivion, and escape the town herself, knowing that Salt Haven would be forgotten forever? Mara closed her eyes, the weight of her decision settling over her like a suffocating cloud. The truth had never been so clear. The only way to end the curse was for her to remain in Salt Haven, to sacrifice herself to the town's twisted fate. She would become part of it, another lost soul, another shadow in the fog. But by doing so, the town would finally be freed. The people would find peace, and Salt Haven would be no more. She could feel the chest trembling beneath her fingertips, as though it were waiting for her decision. There was no other choice. Mara knew it deep in her bones. With one last, shuddering breath, she closed her eyes and pressed her palm flat against the chest. The air crackled with energy, and the town seemed to lurch, as if taking its final breath. And then there was nothing. The silence that followed was absolute. Mara opened her eyes, but she was no longer in the mansion. The fog had dissipated, and the streets of Salt Haven were empty. The buildings stood tall, no longer decaying, no longer warped by time. It was as though the town had been reborn, freed from the curse that had bound it for so long. But Mara knew better. The town was gone, and so was she. She had made the ultimate sacrifice, but in doing so, she had ensured that Salt Haven's story would end. The curse had claimed its last victim, and the reckoning was over. As Mara's form began to fade into the ether, she heard one last whisper. "Thank you."